She stole from our parents, Eleanor, and if you ever show your face here again, we'll call the police. That was the sentence that shattered Eleanor Whitmore's life 5 years ago, spoken in her father's steady voice, while her younger sister stood beside him with tears that looked convincing enough to pass for truth. Now, at 67, Eleanor stood in the harsh fluorescent light of Mercy General Hospital's emergency room, staring at a clipboard a nurse had just handed her. "Are you Claire Whitmore's emergency contact?" the nurse asked gently, unaware that the name on that form belonged to the woman whose lie had cost Eleanor her family. The air in the waiting area smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee. A television mounted in the corner played a morning news segment no one was watching. Outside, rain tapped against the tall glass windows, steady and cold, like time marking its own rhythm. Eleanor had not seen Claire in 5 years. Not since that Sunday afternoon in their parents' colonial-style home in Columbus, Ohio, when accusations had filled the dining room heavier than the pot roast cooling on the table. Claire had claimed that Eleanor siphoned money from the account meant to cover their parents' medical expenses. She said she had proof. She said she had bank statements. She said she had no choice but to expose the betrayal. Their mother, Margaret, had cried quietly into a linen napkin. Their father, Robert, had removed his glasses and folded them with deliberate calm before delivering his verdict. Eleanor had tried to speak, but every sentence felt small against Claire's rehearsed certainty. In the end, silence seemed more dignified than pleading. She packed a single suitcase that night, drove 142 miles to a modest apartment outside Cincinnati, and began the slow work of rebuilding a life without Sunday dinners, without holiday cards signed "Love, Mom and Dad," without the comfort of belonging somewhere. She did not sue. She did not demand forensic audits. She told herself that truth did not need to shout. It only needed time. In the years that followed, Eleanor found steady work as a financial consultant for a nonprofit senior advocacy center. She paid her bills on time, walked 3 miles every morning along the Ohio River Trail, and learned how to cook for one. There were Thanksgivings spent with coworkers, Christmas mornings that began with quiet coffee instead of laughter, birthdays acknowledged only by a calendar reminder. She endured them all with a composed expression that few could read. And now here she was, standing beneath hospital lights that made everyone look pale, listening as the nurse explained that Claire had collapsed at home and was in critical condition pending evaluation. Her husband was out of state. Their parents were unreachable. The hospital had found Eleanor's name listed as the primary contact on an older file. Eleanor stared at the line where a signature was required for consent to treatment decisions. 5 years ago, her family had decided she was a thief. Today, she was the only person authorized to decide what happened next. She did not smile. She did not tremble. She simply took the pen, feeling the weight of history settle into her palm, and understood that sometimes the truth waits quietly for the exact moment when it is needed most. The pen felt heavier than it should have as Eleanor signed her name in careful, deliberate script, the same handwriting she had used for decades on birthday cards and mortgage documents and holiday checks to her parents. The nurse thanked her and disappeared behind a set of double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," leaving Eleanor alone with the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of monitors. She lowered herself into a molded plastic chair and folded her hands in her lap, noticing that they were steady. 5 years ago they had not been steady. 5 years ago they had trembled as she tried to explain that she had never touched a single dollar of the account set aside for Robert and Margaret's medical care. She could still see the dining room in her mind, the oak table polished for Sunday supper, the framed photographs lining the walls, Claire standing with a stack of printed bank statements as though presenting evidence in a courtroom. Claire had pointed to withdrawals, to transfers, to numbers that looked alarming when arranged in neat columns. Eleanor had asked to see the online access logs, had asked for time to call the bank manager she had known for nearly 15 years, but her father had shaken his head before she finished the sentence. He said that trust, once broken, could not be restored by spreadsheets. Margaret had whispered that they were disappointed, not angry, which somehow felt worse. That night, Eleanor had driven south along Interstate 71 with the radio turned off, watching mile markers blur past in the dark, wondering how quickly a lifetime of shared holidays could be rewritten by a single accusation. In the weeks that followed, She requested copies of the account activity through formal channels, but by then her access had been revoked. The passwords had been changed. Her name had been removed as joint overseer. The bank would not discuss details without authorization from Robert, and Robert would not return her calls. Friends from church stopped inviting her to Wednesday potlucks. A neighbor she had known for 20 years crossed the street rather than greet her. Eleanor learned that reputation could evaporate faster than summer rain on hot pavement. Instead of fighting publicly, she focused on survival. She accepted a consulting role at the Senior Advocacy Center, helping widows understand pension statements and navigate Medicare paperwork. She rented a modest one-bedroom apartment with beige carpeting and a balcony that overlooked a parking lot. Every month, she set aside a portion of her paycheck into savings, not because she expected reconciliation, but because independence required preparation. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to notice inconsistencies in the story that had destroyed her place in the family. Dates on the statements Claire had shown did not align with the times Eleanor had even been in Columbus. Transfers had occurred on afternoons when she had been logged into client meetings 90 miles away. She kept copies of her work schedules, her mileage logs, her calendar entries. She did not send them to anyone. She did not demand apologies. She placed them in a manila folder labeled Simply Records and stored it in a fireproof box beneath her bed. Now, in the waiting room of Mercy General, as footsteps echoed down polished tile floors and an overhead speaker called for a respiratory therapist, Eleanor understood that the past had never truly been buried. It had only been waiting, patient and quiet, for circumstances to shift. Somewhere beyond those closed doors, Claire lay unconscious, dependent on a sister she had publicly condemned. Eleanor did not feel triumph. She felt clarity. The truth had not rushed to defend her 5 years ago. It had chosen a longer path. An hour passed before a physician in blue scrubs approached Eleanor with a tablet tucked against his chest, and a careful expression that suggested he had delivered difficult news many times before. He explained that Claire had suffered a severe cardiac episode brought on by prolonged stress and untreated hypertension, that she was stable for the moment but required immediate intervention, and that certain decisions needed to be confirmed by the designated contact. Eleanor listened without interrupting, absorbing each clinical term as though it belonged to a stranger's story rather than her own family. Through a narrow window in the corridor, she caught a glimpse of Claire lying still beneath white hospital sheets, her face pale against the pillow, her dark hair streaked with more gray than Eleanor remembered. Time had not spared either of them. The doctor asked if there were any existing directives, any legal documents specifying Claire's wishes. Eleanor shook her head slowly. 5 years ago, she had been erased from family discussions about finances and health. She had not been invited to planning meetings, had not been consulted about insurance updates or power of attorney forms. Yet somehow her name remained buried in the hospital's records as the person to call in an emergency. The irony did not escape her. While the medical team prepared paperwork, Eleanor stepped into the hallway and dialed her parents' home number from memory. It rang 6 times before Margaret answered, her voice thinner than Eleanor remembered, tinged with confusion. When Eleanor explained where she was, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Margaret said that Robert had been having memory lapses and that she could not drive at night anymore. She asked if Claire was going to be all right. Eleanor responded that the doctors were doing everything they could, her tone steady, professional, almost detached. Margaret began to cry softly and said that perhaps this was a sign that the family needed to come back together. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, leaning against the cool, painted wall of the corridor. 5 years earlier, when she had tried to present her own documents and timelines to defend herself, Margaret had refused to look at them. She had said that continuing the discussion would only create more pain. Now pain had arrived anyway, uninvited and undeniable. Eleanor assured her mother that she would stay at the hospital and keep her informed. After ending the call, she sat once more in the waiting area and opened her leather handbag. Inside was her slim tablet, the same one she used at the nonprofit to review client accounts. Without hesitation, she accessed the secure cloud folder where she had stored copies of her archived records, the mileage logs, the calendar entries, the email confirmations that proved where she had been on the days the suspicious withdrawals occurred. She did not open them out of spite. She opened them because clarity required preparation. As monitors beeped beyond the closed doors and nurses moved briskly past, Eleanor felt a quiet alignment inside herself. She had spent 5 years living as though the truth was a private possession, something she carried alone like a folded letter in her pocket. Tonight, circumstances had shifted. The same family that had once shut her out now depended on her judgment and her memory. She did not know what the coming hours would demand, but she knew one thing with certainty. If the past was going to be revisited, it would be examined fully, without raised voices, without theatrics, and without the convenience of selective memory. By midnight, the waiting room had grown quieter, the daytime rush replaced by a low murmur of distant voices and the soft squeak of rubber soles against polished floors. Eleanor remained seated beneath the muted television screen, her tablet resting closed on her lap, her posture composed in a way that suggested patience rather than exhaustion. A nurse eventually approached and informed her that Claire had been moved to a monitored cardiac unit and would regain consciousness within a few hours if her condition continued to stabilize. The words were clinical and measured, but they carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that Eleanor recognized from her years helping elderly clients navigate hospitals and insurance approvals. Nothing in life was guaranteed, not even the next conversation. After the nurse left, Eleanor stood and walked slowly down the corridor toward the observation window outside the cardiac unit. Through the glass, she could see Claire surrounded by quiet machines and steady green lines moving across a monitor. The sight stirred memories that Eleanor had not allowed herself to revisit in years. She remembered the two of them as girls sharing a bedroom painted pale yellow, whispering long after bedtime about dreams of careers and travel. She remembered driving Claire to her first job interview, helping her choose a navy blazer. That made her look confident and capable. Somewhere between those early loyalties and the afternoon of accusation, something had shifted. Eleanor began to trace it back in her mind with the same analytical care she applied to financial ledgers. The account in question had been created when Robert underwent knee replacement surgery at age 72. Eleanor had suggested consolidating medical savings into a single managed fund to simplify oversight. Claire had initially supported the idea, even praising Eleanor's experience in finance. Yet months later, Claire insisted on separate online access credentials. She said she wanted to learn. Eleanor agreed without hesitation, believing transparency built trust. It was shortly after that change that unfamiliar transactions began appearing. Small at first, then larger. Eleanor had noticed irregularities and drafted an email asking Claire to review them together. The message had never been answered. Instead, weeks later, the confrontation occurred. Standing now in the hospital hallway, Eleanor felt the pattern sharpen in her memory. The dates of the suspicious transfers aligned precisely with times when Claire had exclusive access. Eleanor had been traveling between Cincinnati and Dayton for client consultations, logging her mileage in detail for reimbursement purposes. She had been in conference rooms with witnesses, signing nonprofit contracts, leading seminars on financial responsibility. Those records were time-stamped and archived. The folder beneath her bed contained not accusations, but verification. A soft sound drew her attention back to the present as a young resident stepped out of the unit and approached her with an update. Claire was awake but disoriented, asking for her parents. Eleanor nodded and thanked him. She did not rush inside. She understood that re-entering Claire's life, even within hospital walls, required intention rather than impulse. 5 years earlier, she had been cast as a villain without an opportunity to defend herself. Tonight, she possessed both the authority and the evidence to reshape that narrative. Yet she did not feel driven by revenge. She felt compelled by accuracy. As she stood there, watching the steady rhythm on the monitor through the glass, Eleanor realized that the coming conversation would not be about anger. It would be about facts, about timelines, about choices made in silence. And for the first time since she had packed that single suitcase and driven 142 miles away from her childhood home, she sensed that the truth was no longer something she carried alone. Claire regained full consciousness just after 2 a.m, and the nurse informed Eleanor that she could step inside for a brief visit. The cardiac unit was dimly lit, the overhead lights lowered to a soft glow that made the machines seem less intrusive. Claire lay propped against white pillows, an oxygen line resting beneath her nose, her eyes unfocused at first before settling on the figure standing near the doorway. For a moment neither sister spoke. The years between them felt visible, suspended in the sterile air along with the faint scent of disinfectant. Claire's voice, when it finally emerged, was thinner than Eleanor remembered. She asked if their parents had been notified. Eleanor replied that she had spoken to Margaret and that Robert was resting at home. She kept her tone neutral, neither warm nor cold, as if discussing a client's appointment rather than a fractured family. Claire's gaze shifted to the monitor beside her bed, watching the steady rise and fall of the green line. She said she had not expected to see Eleanor there. The statement was simple, but it carried layers. Eleanor moved a chair closer to the bed and sat down with deliberate calm. She explained that the hospital had listed her as the emergency contact and that someone needed to make medical decisions until Claire's husband could return from out of state. Claire nodded faintly, her hand adjusting the thin hospital blanket. Silence settled again, heavy but not hostile. Eleanor studied her sister's face, noticing the fine lines at the corners of her eyes and the faint tremor in her fingers. Stress had etched itself into Claire in ways that could not be concealed by confidence or carefully arranged words. After several seconds, Claire asked quietly whether Eleanor still believed she had done nothing wrong 5 years ago. The question hung between them, fragile and direct. Eleanor did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her handbag and removed her tablet, placing it on her lap without turning it on. She said that belief had never been the issue. Records had been. Timelines had been. Access credentials had been. She explained in a measured voice that she had kept documentation of her whereabouts and financial logs from that period, not as a weapon, but as confirmation. Claire's eyes flickered with something that resembled unease. She attempted to shift the conversation toward the present, mentioning mounting bills, the strain of managing their parents' care, the difficulty of keeping everything organized. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression composed. She acknowledged that responsibility could be overwhelming, especially when handled alone. Then she asked a single question, her tone steady and almost conversational. On the days the transfers occurred, where had Claire been? The machines continued their quiet rhythm as Claire looked away, her gaze settling on the ceiling tiles as though they might offer a simpler answer. Eleanor did not press further. She did not raise her voice or recount the humiliation of that long-ago afternoon. Instead, she let the silence expand just enough for recognition to take shape. Outside the room, a nurse passed by with a chart, and somewhere down the corridor a cart rolled over tile. Within the stillness of the cardiac unit, the narrative that had once seemed fixed began to loosen at its edges. Eleanor had not returned seeking apology. She had returned because circumstances required her presence. Yet as she watched Claire struggle to meet her eyes, she sensed that the story constructed 5 years earlier could no longer withstand careful examination. And for the first time, the imbalance between them had shifted without Eleanor needing to demand it. Claire did not answer the question that night, and Eleanor did not insist. Instead, she rose from the chair and told her sister that the doctors wanted her to rest, that stress would not help her heart recover, and that there would be time to discuss everything once she was stronger. Claire nodded, her composure thinner than before, and turned her face slightly toward the window as though the darkness outside could shield her from what remained unspoken. Eleanor stepped back into the corridor and allowed the door to close softly behind her. The hallway felt cooler now, the air conditioning humming steadily above the ceiling tiles. She walked toward the small family consultation room the nurse had mentioned earlier, a space with muted gray walls and a round table meant for difficult conversations. Sitting down alone, she opened her tablet and scrolled through the archived files with deliberate focus. There were time-stamped emails confirming her attendance at a financial planning seminar in Dayton on the exact afternoon one of the largest transfers had occurred. There were mileage reimbursement forms submitted to the nonprofit, signed and approved, documenting that she had been 93 miles away from Columbus that same day. There were cell phone location logs preserved through her service provider, data she had requested quietly months after the accusation when she first realized the magnitude of what had happened. Each record aligned with precision, forming a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Eleanor leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes briefly, not from exhaustion but from recognition. Claire had not made a mistake in arithmetic. Claire had made a choice. The motive, however, was still unclear. Financial strain? Resentment over their parents' trust in Eleanor's expertise? Or something more complicated, something rooted in rivalry that had never been addressed openly? The door opened gently, and a hospital social worker introduced herself, explaining that extended family members were expected to arrive by morning. Eleanor informed her that she would remain until Claire's husband reached the hospital and that she was prepared to review any necessary documentation. The social worker thanked her and mentioned how fortunate Claire was to have such support. Eleanor offered a polite nod. Fortune had not been part of her experience 5 years earlier, yet she did not correct the assumption. As dawn approached, faint light began to seep through the high windows at the end of the corridor, softening the starkness of the night. Eleanor walked to the vending machine, purchased a bottle of water, and returned to the consultation room. She reviewed once more the dates and figures, confirming what she already knew. When morning arrived, and when conversations inevitably resumed, she would not rely on emotion or memory alone. She would rely on evidence. Not to humiliate, not to dominate, but to restore balance. 5 years had given her distance and discipline. The waiting had not weakened her. It had clarified her. And as the first rays of sunlight touched the hospital floor, Eleanor understood that the moment for quiet endurance was ending. What came next would not require anger. It would require precision. By 7 in the morning, the hospital had shifted from the quiet stillness of night to the brisk rhythm of a weekday. Nurses changed shifts, carts rolled past carrying trays of supplies, and muted conversations filled the corridor outside the cardiac unit. Eleanor remained composed, seated at the small round table in the consultation room, her tablet closed now, her decision made. She would not ambush. She would not accuse. She would allow events to unfold and then present what needed to be presented. Shortly after sunrise, Claire's husband, Daniel Harper, arrived from Indianapolis, his travel bag slung over his shoulder and worry etched across his face. He thanked Eleanor for staying through the night, his tone strained but polite. Eleanor responded with equal courtesy and brief clarity, explaining Claire's condition as the doctors had described it. Daniel seemed surprised to learn that Eleanor had been listed as the emergency contact. He said he assumed that had been changed years ago. Eleanor did not comment on that. Instead, she accompanied him to the cardiac unit, where Claire now sat upright. Her color slightly improved, but her expression guarded. The reunion between husband and wife was quiet and emotional, yet restrained. Eleanor stood a few steps back, observing without intrusion. When Daniel asked what had happened, Claire attributed her condition to exhaustion and mounting responsibilities, mentioning the financial strain of managing their parents' long-term care and the pressure of keeping everything organized. Eleanor listened carefully to the phrasing. Financial strain. Managing everything alone. The same narrative pattern that had surfaced 5 years earlier began to echo again. Later that morning, Margaret arrived at the hospital with the assistance of a neighbor who drove her from Columbus. She looked smaller than Eleanor remembered, her coat buttoned unevenly, her eyes anxious. Upon seeing both daughters in the same room for the first time in years, Margaret's composure faltered. She grasped Eleanor's hands and whispered that families should not remain divided. Eleanor returned the gesture gently, but did not allow the moment to dissolve into sentiment. Instead, she suggested that once Claire felt stronger, they should all sit down together with the relevant documents and clarify what had happened in the past. Margaret hesitated, her gaze flickering toward Claire. For years she had avoided revisiting the accusation, choosing quiet acceptance over confrontation. But circumstances had shifted. The hospital setting stripped away pretense. Claire, still pale but alert, agreed reluctantly to a discussion later that afternoon. She said that perhaps misunderstandings had grown larger than they needed to be. Eleanor acknowledged the possibility without endorsing it. She retrieved her tablet and informed them that she had preserved detailed records from that period, including time-stamped work logs and location data that would help reconstruct the timeline accurately. Daniel's expression tightened slightly as he looked from one sister to the other. Margaret sank into the chair beside the bed, silent. There was no raised voice, no dramatic accusation, only the steady implication that facts would soon replace memory. As the room settled into uneasy anticipation, Eleanor felt neither triumph nor resentment. She felt alignment. For 5 years, the family had operated under an assumption presented as certainty. Now certainty would be tested. And as she met Claire's eyes across the narrow hospital space, Eleanor understood that the coming conversation would determine not only who had been truthful, but who was willing to face the full weight of that truth. The discussion took place later that afternoon in the same consultation room where Eleanor had spent the night, the round table now occupied by 4 people bound by history and strained by silence. Claire had been wheeled in temporarily, her hospital bracelet visible against her wrist, Daniel seated close beside her, Margaret across from Eleanor with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The atmosphere was not hostile, but it was charged with anticipation. Eleanor began without preface, her voice calm and even, explaining that she had brought documentation not to accuse but to clarify. She placed her tablet on the table and turned the screen so that everyone could see. The first document displayed was a non-profit attendance record showing her presence at a financial planning workshop in Dayton on the afternoon of March 17, 5 years earlier, the exact date one of the largest transfers from the medical account had occurred. She then opened a mileage reimbursement form approved and signed by her supervisor, confirming that she had driven 93 miles from Cincinnati that same day and had not returned to Columbus until late evening. Daniel leaned forward slightly, studying the timestamps. Margaret's breathing grew uneven as she watched the screen. Eleanor moved to the next file, an archived email requesting a review of unusual transactions, sent to Claire 2 weeks before the confrontation that had ended their relationship. The email had never been answered. She did not emphasize that detail. She simply allowed it to remain visible. Claire shifted in her chair, her composure thinning. She said that records could be manipulated and that memory was not always precise. Eleanor nodded and agreed that memory could indeed be unreliable, which was why she had also obtained location data from her mobile service provider confirming her physical presence in Dayton during the hours in question. She opened the final document, a secure report listing the Internet protocol addresses used to access the account during the disputed transactions. The addresses traced back to a residential connection in Columbus registered under Claire and Daniel's home. The room fell silent in a way that felt heavier than raised voices ever could. Daniel's expression changed first, confusion giving way to concern as he turned toward his wife. Margaret pressed her lips together, her gaze fixed on the table. Claire's hands tightened around the thin hospital blanket draped across her knees. She attempted to explain that she had intended to replace the funds before anyone noticed, that she had been under pressure and had convinced herself it was temporary. Her words came slowly, each one diminishing the certainty she had once displayed. Eleanor listened without interruption, her posture steady. She did not remind them of the night she had packed her suitcase. She did not recount the neighbors who had turned away from her in the grocery store. She simply asked one question, her tone measured and clear. Why had she been accused instead of consulted? Claire's answer did not arrive immediately. It hovered somewhere between pride and fear, between rivalry and desperation. Margaret's voice trembled as she whispered that they had been wrong to assume. Daniel looked at the floor. Eleanor felt no surge of victory, only a quiet confirmation of what she had known all along. The truth, when presented without anger, had a way of standing on its own. And in that small hospital room, surrounded by medical equipment and the soft hum of air vents, the version of events that had defined 5 years of estrangement began to unravel under the weight of evidence. No one spoke for several seconds after Claire's admission, and the silence that followed did not feel accidental. It felt earned. The evidence remained on the tablet screen between them, a quiet display of dates and addresses that no longer required interpretation. Claire's voice, when it returned, carried none of the sharp certainty she had once used at the dining room table 5 years earlier. She said that she had panicked when bills began to stack up and that she had believed she could borrow the money temporarily, restore it before anyone reviewed the account, and spare their parents additional worry. She admitted that when Eleanor questioned the transactions through email, fear overtook reason. She convinced herself that redirecting suspicion would be easier than confessing her own misjudgment. Daniel exhaled slowly, absorbing each word as though recalibrating his understanding of the past several years. Margaret covered her mouth with trembling fingers, her eyes glossy with regret. Eleanor remained still, her hands folded loosely on the table. She did not interrupt. She did not press for more detail. She allowed the explanation to unfold in its imperfect, uncomfortable completeness. Claire then acknowledged that once the accusation had been made publicly, pride prevented her from retracting it. She had underestimated the consequences. She had believed that Eleanor would defend herself loudly, that the truth would surface quickly and the matter would resolve. Instead, Eleanor had chosen silence. That silence, Claire admitted, had forced the family to accept the version of events she had created. The weight of that realization seemed to settle visibly on her shoulders. Margaret began to cry openly, whispering that they had failed both daughters by choosing convenience over verification. She confessed that they had not requested independent review of the account because doing so would have meant confronting the possibility that they had misjudged the wrong person. Eleanor listened to the confession without visible reaction. 5 years earlier, she had imagined countless scenarios in which this moment might arrive, each version colored by anger or vindication. Yet seated now in a hospital consultation room, she felt neither. What she felt was a quiet steadiness, the kind that comes from having already rebuilt what was lost. Daniel turned toward Eleanor and apologized for not questioning the evidence at the time. He admitted that he had trusted the narrative presented to him and had encouraged Claire to protect herself rather than examine the discrepancies. His voice carried genuine remorse. Eleanor acknowledged his words with a slight nod. She understood how easily a well-framed accusation could redirect doubt. She had seen similar dynamics in financial disputes among her clients, where fear often replaced scrutiny. After the initial rush of confession subsided, the room settled into a different kind of silence, one shaped by accountability rather than suspicion. Margaret asked softly whether there was any way to repair what had been broken. Eleanor considered the question carefully. Repair did not erase history. It required structure and transparency. She said that reconciliation, if it were to occur, would depend on complete financial disclosure, formal correction of the records, and a written statement clarifying the truth to those who had been told otherwise. Her tone was not punitive. It was procedural. Claire nodded slowly, understanding that the cost of her decision had extended far beyond money. The narrative that had defined 5 years of estrangement had finally shifted. Not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through documentation and patience. And as Eleanor gathered her tablet and prepared to leave the consultation room, she recognized that the most powerful response had not been retaliation. It had been restraint. When the meeting ended, no one rushed to leave. The weight of confession lingered in the small consultation room like the faint hum of the ventilation system above them. Claire looked diminished, not because of illness alone, but because certainty had been replaced with exposure. Daniel remained beside her, his posture protective yet thoughtful, as though recalculating the last 5 years in quiet increments. Margaret wiped her eyes and asked Eleanor if she would consider coming to the house in Columbus once Claire was discharged, suggesting that perhaps it was time for the family to sit around the same table again. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She understood the symbolism of that table. It had been the site of accusation, of judgment delivered without review. Returning to it would not be casual. It would be deliberate. She explained calmly that before any gathering took place, several practical steps needed to occur. The medical account would require a formal audit conducted by an independent financial examiner. A written statement correcting the prior accusation would need to be shared with extended relatives and the church community that had been informed of her supposed misconduct. And the account balances would need to be restored fully, with documentation confirming repayment. Her voice did not rise. It did not soften either. It carried the same professional clarity she used with nonprofit clients facing complex estate issues. Claire listened without objection. She nodded slowly, acknowledging that repair demanded structure, not sentiment. Daniel agreed to coordinate with a certified public accountant to initiate the review. Margaret whispered that she would support whatever process Eleanor deemed necessary. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt no need to defend herself. The defense had already been completed through evidence. What remained was restoration, and restoration required transparency. A nurse entered briefly to escort Claire back to the cardiac unit for further monitoring. Before leaving, Claire looked directly at Eleanor and said that she was sorry, not in a dramatic tone, but in a way that suggested understanding rather than obligation. Eleanor accepted the words with a slight inclination of her head. Apology alone did not erase 5 years of absence, of birthdays spent alone, of invitations never extended. But acknowledgement created space where denial once stood. After Claire was wheeled away, Eleanor stepped into the hallway and walked toward the large windows overlooking the hospital parking lot. Morning traffic had increased, cars pulling in and out beneath a pale Ohio sky. She considered the distance she had traveled, not in miles measured along Interstate 71, but in discipline and restraint. 5 years earlier, she had left Columbus with a single suitcase and a damaged reputation. She had rebuilt quietly, strengthened by structure rather than sympathy. Now she stood not as someone seeking vindication, but as someone prepared to establish terms. When Daniel approached to thank her again for staying through the night, she told him that she would remain involved only to ensure that their parents' finances were secured properly moving forward. Beyond that, relationships would require time. He understood. As Eleanor gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the hospital for a few hours of rest, she felt something unfamiliar yet steady. It was not triumph. It was equilibrium. The narrative that once defined her had shifted permanently, not because she forced it, but because she waited until facts could no longer be ignored. And as she stepped out into the cool morning air, she understood that the most enduring strength had not been in proving others wrong, but in remaining consistent long enough for the truth to reveal itself. The drive back to Cincinnati felt different from the one she had taken 5 years earlier. Then, the highway had stretched ahead like exile, mile markers counting distance from everything familiar. Now, as Eleanor guided her sedan south along Interstate 71 beneath a pale afternoon sky, the road felt measured rather than lonely. She did not turn on the radio. She preferred the quiet hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of tires against asphalt. The hospital conversation replayed in her mind, not as confrontation, but as correction. Facts had been placed on the table. Confession had followed. There had been no shouting, no dramatic collapse into apologies. Only acknowledgement. When she reached her apartment complex just outside Cincinnati, she parked in her usual space and carried her leather handbag upstairs. The beige carpet in the hallway looked the same as it had the night she moved in, a reminder that stability could be simple. Inside, she placed her tablet on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water. The late afternoon sun filtered through the balcony doors, casting long shadows across the small dining table where she often reviewed client documents. For a moment, she allowed herself to sit without planning the next step. 5 years ago, she had spent countless evenings imagining what it would feel like to be proven right. She had imagined satisfaction, perhaps even relief. Instead, what she felt now was steadiness. Later that evening, her phone rang. It was Daniel. He explained that he had already contacted a certified public accountant in Columbus who specialized in forensic review of family-managed accounts. The audit would begin within the week. Claire had agreed to provide full access to bank records and online credentials. Eleanor listened carefully, asking practical questions about timelines and documentation requirements. She offered to forward the digital copies of her archived records to the accountant directly to ensure impartial analysis. Daniel thanked her again, his voice sincere but subdued. After the call ended, Eleanor opened her laptop and drafted a concise email summarizing the documentation she would provide. Her tone was professional, structured, free of commentary. She attached the relevant files and scheduled them for secure transfer in the morning. As she worked, she reflected on how different this process was from the confrontation 5 years earlier. Then, decisions had been made quickly, guided by emotion and assumption. Now, each step followed procedure. Transparency replaced accusation. The following day, Margaret called to say that she had spoken with their pastor and intended to correct the narrative that had circulated within the church community. She said she would write a formal statement clarifying that Eleanor had not mismanaged any funds and that the misunderstanding had originated elsewhere. Eleanor thanked her, recognizing that reputations restored publicly mattered as much as truths acknowledged privately. After ending the call, she stepped onto her balcony and looked out at the parking lot below, where children rode bicycles in slow circles and neighbors carried groceries upstairs. Life continued in ordinary patterns. She realized that the greatest shift had not occurred in the hospital room or in the presentation of evidence. It had occurred within her. 5 years of distance had taught her that identity could not rest solely on the opinions of others. Now that those opinions were changing, she did not feel the urge to rush back into old roles. Repair would happen gradually, if at all. Trust would require consistency over time. As evening settled over the complex and the sky deepened into shades of blue, Eleanor closed the balcony door and prepared dinner for one, aware that equilibrium, once earned, was not easily disturbed. 3 weeks later, the audit report arrived in Eleanor's secure inbox just after 9 in the morning while she was reviewing pension documents for a client at the nonprofit office. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she finished her scheduled consultation, explained Medicare's supplemental options with her usual clarity, and walked the client to the reception desk before returning to her desk and closing the office door. The report was 27 pages long, compiled by an independent certified public accountant with no connection to the family. Eleanor read each page carefully. The findings were precise. The disputed withdrawals had originated from online sessions logged through the residential internet connection registered to Claire and Daniel's address. The timeline of access confirmed that Eleanor had not been physically present during any of the transactions in question. The funds had been redirected into a temporary personal account and later partially repaid in increments that did not restore the full balance. The report concluded that no evidence supported the allegation of misconduct against Eleanor Whitmore. She closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, but in recognition. Independent confirmation mattered, not for her confidence, which had never faltered, but for institutional correction. Within an hour, Daniel called to say that he had reviewed the report as well. His voice carried humility without defensiveness. He explained that Claire had signed a written statement acknowledging responsibility and agreeing to reimburse the remaining balance in full within 60 days. Margaret followed with her own call that afternoon, her tone quieter than usual. She said she had mailed letters to extended relatives and to the church leadership clarifying that Eleanor had been wrongfully accused and that the family regretted not seeking verification sooner. She asked if Eleanor would consider attending Sunday service in Columbus once Claire was released from medical supervision. Eleanor responded that she would consider it after reviewing the formal letters and ensuring that the corrections were clear and complete. She did not speak in absolutes. Trust, once fractured, required measured rebuilding. That evening, she sat at her small dining table in her apartment and reread the audit report once more, not because she doubted its contents, but because she understood its significance. 5 years earlier, she had been judged without procedure. Now procedure had spoken. The difference was not dramatic. It was structural. She printed a single copy of the executive summary and placed it inside the same fireproof box that had once held only her private records. The folder labeled records now contained validation rather than defense. As twilight settled beyond her balcony and the sounds of distant traffic softened, Eleanor felt the final shift occur internally. She no longer needed the documentation to prove anything. The proof existed independently, acknowledged by those who had once dismissed her. The coming weeks would involve careful conversations, perhaps a gradual return to shared spaces, perhaps new boundaries altogether. But the narrative had been corrected in writing, in detail, and without spectacle. Eleanor washed her dinner plate, turned off the kitchen light, and prepared for the next workday. Equilibrium had not arrived through confrontation. It had arrived through patience, documentation, and restraint. And as she lay down to rest, she understood that sometimes the most powerful resolution is not dramatic reconciliation, but the quiet restoration of truth. 2 Sundays later, Eleanor drove back to Columbus for the first time since the audit report had been finalized. The morning was cool, the sky clear, the kind of Ohio autumn day that carried both light and restraint. She parked along the familiar curb near the church building she had once attended every week, noticing that the brick facade and white steeple looked unchanged. What had changed was not the structure. It was her place within it. As she stepped inside, the scent of polished wood and faint perfume met her, memories layered into the walls. Conversations softened when a few familiar faces recognized her. There were no dramatic gestures, no public announcements. Instead, the pastor approached quietly and thanked her for allowing the formal correction letter to be read during the previous service. He said the congregation now understood that a serious misunderstanding had occurred and that Eleanor's integrity had been affirmed by independent review. She nodded politely, accepting the acknowledgement without display. Margaret sat in the second row, her posture straighter than Eleanor had seen in years, as though truth itself had restored some measure of steadiness. When their eyes met, there was gratitude there, but also humility. Claire did not attend that morning, still recovering at home under medical supervision. But she had signed a statement that had been shared with extended family members explaining the full timeline of events and accepting responsibility for the false accusation. Eleanor took her usual seat near the aisle, hands folded in her lap. The hymns felt familiar, yet she listened differently now. 5 years earlier she had left this space carrying the weight of silent judgment. Today, there was no applause for her return, and she did not expect any. What existed instead was balance. After the service, a few members approached with brief words of apology for having assumed rather than questioned. Eleanor responded graciously but did not linger in conversation. Restoration did not require spectacle. Later that afternoon she drove to her parents' house, the colonial-style home where the accusation had once unfolded. The dining room table remained in the same position, polished and orderly. Margaret invited her to sit. There was no raised voice this time, no printed statements spread across wood. Instead, Margaret handed her copies of the mailed letters and confirmation of reimbursement deposits that had already begun restoring the account balance. Eleanor reviewed them carefully, noting the transaction confirmations and scheduled repayment plan. Everything aligned with the audit findings. Robert, quieter than before and occasionally distracted, looked at Eleanor with something like recognition mixed with regret. He said he should have insisted on reviewing the details 5 years ago. Eleanor answered simply that clarity had arrived eventually. They spoke for nearly an hour, not about blame, but about logistics, about future oversight of the account, about establishing dual signature requirements and quarterly reviews to prevent any similar issue from emerging again. It was procedural, structured, intentional. As Eleanor prepared to leave, she paused at the doorway of the dining room and observed the space without emotion. It no longer represented humiliation. It represented correction. The road back to Cincinnati felt lighter than any drive she had taken before. She understood that reconciliation would be gradual and that trust would rebuild in increments measured not by words, but by consistent action. What mattered most was not the return itself, but the conditions under which it occurred. And those conditions were now clear, documented, and grounded in truth. In the weeks that followed, the changes were not dramatic, but they were consistent. Claire continued her cardiac rehabilitation under medical supervision, attending scheduled checkups and adjusting her daily routine with new discipline. Daniel kept his word about the reimbursement plan, forwarding monthly confirmations to both Eleanor and the independent accountant overseeing the account. The balance gradually returned to its intended level, not in one grand gesture, but in steady increments that reflected accountability rather than impulse. Eleanor did not insert herself into every conversation. She allowed space. Yet she remained involved in the oversight structure that had been formally established. Quarterly financial reviews were scheduled with documented minutes. Dual authorization requirements were implemented for any transaction exceeding $500, and secure password management procedures were put in place. These were not emotional solutions. They were structural ones. One afternoon, Claire requested that Eleanor meet her for coffee at a small cafe halfway between Columbus and Cincinnati, a neutral location off Highway 71. The cafe was quiet, with soft instrumental music playing in the background and sunlight filtering through tall front windows. Claire arrived looking healthier than she had in the hospital, though still reflective. She thanked Eleanor for insisting on transparency instead of retaliation. She admitted that pride had fueled her silence years earlier, and that watching Eleanor respond with composure rather than anger had unsettled her more than confrontation would have. Eleanor listened without interruption. She explained that her silence 5 years ago had not been weakness. It had been calculation. She had understood that truth supported by documentation would outlast any emotional defense. Claire nodded slowly, acknowledging that she had underestimated both Eleanor's patience and her preparation. They spoke not only about the past, but about their parents' future care. Robert's memory lapses were becoming more frequent, and Margaret needed additional support managing appointments. Eleanor proposed hiring a part-time care coordinator to relieve pressure and reduce the risk of financial mismanagement returning under stress. Claire agreed immediately. The conversation shifted from accusation to collaboration, though cautiously. There was no sudden restoration of sisterly closeness. Instead, there was a measured rebuilding grounded in policy and mutual recognition of past failure. When they parted outside the cafe, Claire said she understood that trust would require time measured in actions, not apologies. Eleanor acknowledged that sentiment with a brief nod. Driving back toward Cincinnati, Eleanor reflected on how differently events might have unfolded had she reacted 5 years earlier with outrage rather than restraint. Anger might have created noise, but it would not have created proof. The strength she carried now did not come from being vindicated publicly. It came from knowing she had remained consistent while others shifted around her. As autumn deepened and leaves turned along the highway, Eleanor felt the steady presence of equilibrium again. Repair was ongoing, not complete, but it was grounded in structure. And structure, she knew, was what allowed truth to endure long after emotion faded. By late November, routines had begun to solidify into something that resembled cautious normalcy. The quarterly financial review took place at a small conference room inside a Columbus accounting firm, the same independent firm that had conducted the audit. Eleanor arrived with a leather folder neatly organized, though she knew the documents would confirm what had already been corrected. Claire and Daniel were seated across the polished table, and Margaret sat beside Eleanor with a notepad resting in her lap. Robert remained at home with a hired aide, his memory inconsistent, but his health otherwise stable. The accountant reviewed the updated balances, the restored funds, and the newly implemented safeguards. Dual authorization had been used properly. No irregular transfers had occurred. Every receipt matched the corresponding entry. The report concluded with a statement that the account was now compliant with recommended oversight practices for shared family management. Eleanor listened without satisfaction or resentment. The numbers spoke calmly, and that calmness was enough. After the meeting, Margaret suggested lunch at a nearby diner they had frequented for years. The suggestion felt symbolic, though no one named it as such. They slid into a vinyl booth, the scent of coffee and grilled sandwiches filling the air. Conversation remained measured, but it no longer felt fragile. Claire discussed her rehabilitation progress and her intention to reduce work hours temporarily to focus on health and family stability. Daniel mentioned adjustments to their household budget too. Prevent any future strain that might tempt short-term solutions. Eleanor contributed thoughtfully, outlining a proposed long-term care planning strategy for their parents that included automatic payment scheduling and an external review every 6 months. There was no tension in her tone, only structure. At one point, Margaret reached across the table and touched Eleanor's hand lightly, not dramatically, but with quiet acknowledgement. Eleanor did not pull away. She allowed the gesture without interpreting it as closure. Closure was not a single event. It was a sequence of consistent choices. Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited her parents' home briefly to review the new care coordinator's schedule. The coordinator had already organized medication reminders, transportation appointments, and updated insurance documentation. The system felt secure. Before leaving, Eleanor stood once more in the dining room where the original accusation had unfolded. The room looked unchanged, yet its meaning had shifted completely. It no longer represented humiliation or exile. It represented correction followed by reconstruction. As she drove back toward Cincinnati with early winter light fading along the horizon, Eleanor considered the arc of the past months. She had not reclaimed her position through confrontation. She had not demanded apology through force. Instead, she had allowed time, documentation, and consistency to alter the narrative. Trust was still rebuilding, measured in meetings and written confirmations rather than sentiment. But the foundation was no longer assumption. It was transparency. And as the highway stretched ahead beneath a deepening gray sky, Eleanor understood that what had once seemed like permanent loss had become a lesson in endurance. The strength she carried forward was not rooted in being proven right. It was rooted in knowing she had never needed to prove herself loudly at all. Winter settled fully over Ohio by the time the next quarterly review approached, bringing early sunsets and a quiet layer of frost that coated sidewalks each morning. Eleanor's routine in Cincinnati remained steady, her days divided between client consultations at the nonprofit and scheduled calls with the care coordinator overseeing her parents' appointments. The structure that had been implemented months earlier continued to function without disruption. Automatic payments processed on time. Dual signatures were documented digitally. The external accountant sent brief monthly summaries confirming that no irregularities had appeared. Stability, Eleanor knew, was not dramatic. It was repetitive. One evening in early January, Claire called unexpectedly, not about finances, but about Robert. His memory lapses had grown more frequent, and he had begun confusing recent events with conversations from decades earlier. Margaret was overwhelmed, trying to manage medical appointments while also adjusting to the emotional weight of watching her husband change. Claire asked whether Eleanor would consider spending a weekend in Columbus to help reorganize the household records and discuss long-term planning options. The request carried no defensiveness, only recognition that collaboration was necessary. Eleanor agreed without hesitation. That Friday afternoon she drove north again, the highway lined with bare trees and muted winter fields. At the house, she found Margaret tired but relieved to see her. Robert greeted Eleanor warmly, though he referred to her by Claire's name at first before correcting himself. There was no embarrassment in his confusion, only fragility. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor and Claire worked side by side at the dining room table, sorting insurance statements, labeling medication schedules, and updating a shared digital calendar accessible to all responsible parties. The process felt practical, almost methodical. At one point, Claire paused and said quietly that she never imagined they would be working together like this again. Eleanor responded that circumstances change when accountability replaces avoidance. There was no accusation in her tone, only acknowledgement of reality. On Sunday afternoon, they met with an elder law attorney to explore options for durable power of attorney and medical directives, ensuring that responsibilities would be clearly defined moving forward. Documents were drafted with careful language, naming both sisters as co-decision makers with specific boundaries to prevent unilateral control. The attorney commended their proactive approach. As they left the office, Claire thanked Eleanor again, this time not for staying silent years ago, but for insisting on systems that protected everyone. Driving back to Cincinnati that evening, Eleanor reflected on the quiet evolution of the past months. What began as exposure in a hospital consultation room had transformed into structured partnership grounded in transparency. There were still moments of awkwardness, still traces of history that could not be erased. But there was also evidence of growth, visible not in declarations, but in actions repeated consistently. As headlights stretched across the darkened highway and winter air pressed against the windshield, Eleanor felt no need to revisit the past for reassurance. The present, organized and accountable, was proof enough that truth, once established firmly, could support even the most fragile rebuilding. By early spring, subtle shifts began to reveal themselves in ways Eleanor had not anticipated. The systems were functioning, the financial oversight remained transparent, and Robert's care had stabilized under the shared authority structure they had created. Yet something less tangible was changing as well. One Saturday afternoon in March, Claire invited Eleanor to attend one of Robert's neurology appointments in Columbus. The specialist explained that while memory decline was progressing, careful planning and cognitive support strategies could extend Robert's independence. Eleanor asked structured questions about medication interactions and long-term projections, taking notes with the same measured focus she applied to financial reviews. Claire listened attentively, occasionally glancing toward her sister as though recalibrating an old assumption about who Eleanor truly was. After the appointment, they walked together through a small park near the medical center. The trees were beginning to show the first signs of green, tentative but present. Claire spoke quietly, reflecting on how easily fear had once dictated her decisions. She admitted that when the financial pressure mounted years ago, she had convinced herself that Eleanor's competence was a threat rather than an asset. Redirecting suspicion had felt easier than admitting vulnerability. Eleanor absorbed the confession without judgment. She understood now that insecurity often disguised itself as certainty. What mattered was not the motive alone, but the willingness to confront it honestly. Later that evening, the sisters reviewed Robert's updated care plan with Margaret at the kitchen table. The conversation was practical and calm. Margaret expressed gratitude for their cooperation, acknowledging that the strain of the past had weakened her own ability to intervene decisively. Eleanor reassured her that the new framework prevented any single person from carrying overwhelming responsibility. As the discussion concluded, Robert entered the room and paused, looking at both daughters with visible concentration. He said that he was glad they were working together again, though he admitted he did not remember precisely why they had stopped. The statement lingered in the air, both painful and liberating. Memory had once preserved accusation. Now its fading removed some of the bitterness attached to it. Driving back to Cincinnati that night, Eleanor considered how different reconciliation looked when built on accountability rather than nostalgia. There had been no dramatic reunion, no sweeping declarations of forgiveness. Instead, there had been incremental proof of reliability, demonstrated repeatedly. The quiet authority she carried no longer felt defensive. It felt natural. She realized that the most enduring transformation had not occurred in Claire or Margaret, but within herself. She no longer sought validation from those who once doubted her. She sought clarity and structure, and she maintained them regardless of others' perceptions. As spring deepened and the air softened along the highway, Eleanor recognized that the events which once severed her from her family had ultimately strengthened her internal foundation. What had begun as exile had evolved into equilibrium, and that equilibrium did not depend on applause or apology. It depended on consistency, and consistency had become her steady ground. By late April, the rhythm of shared responsibility had begun to feel less like repair and more like routine. Eleanor received the monthly financial summary from the independent accountant on a quiet Tuesday morning while she was preparing materials for a retirement planning seminar in Cincinnati. The report confirmed that all reimbursements had been completed in full, the account balance restored precisely to its intended reserve amount, with documented confirmation attached. There were no discrepancies, no unexplained transfers, no irregular access logs. The structure they had built was holding. That evening, Claire called with a different tone than before. There was no urgency in her voice, no request for correction. Instead, she asked if Eleanor would join her and Margaret for a small family dinner the following weekend to discuss long-term plans for the house in Columbus. Robert's condition was stable but slowly progressing, and the question of whether to modify the home for accessibility or consider a transition to assisted living needed thoughtful discussion. Eleanor agreed, aware that this type of conversation required clarity rather than sentiment. When she arrived that Saturday, the house felt quieter than it once had. Robert sat in his armchair by the window, gazing at the yard where early spring flowers had begun to bloom. He greeted Eleanor warmly, his smile genuine even if his memory sometimes faltered. Around the dining table, the discussion unfolded in calm, structured steps. Claire presented cost estimates for installing handrails, widening doorways, and adjusting the bathroom layout. Eleanor reviewed the figures carefully, suggesting they compare those modifications against projected costs for assisted living facilities within a 30-mile radius. She spoke without dominance, but with authority grounded in experience. Margaret listened closely, asking practical questions rather than emotional ones. The atmosphere remained steady, collaborative. At one point, Claire paused and said that 5 years earlier she would have interpreted Eleanor's precision as criticism. Now she recognized it as protection. The comment was simple, yet it carried weight. Eleanor responded that clarity prevented misunderstanding, and misunderstanding had already cost them enough. There was no bitterness in her tone, only perspective. By the end of the afternoon, they agreed to schedule consultations with 2 local assisted living communities while simultaneously obtaining detailed contractor bids for home modifications. No decision would be rushed. Everything would be documented. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Margaret walked her to the door and thanked her quietly for returning when she could have remained distant. Eleanor answered that distance had once been necessary for stability, but now stability allowed for return. Driving back towards Cincinnati beneath a sky streaked with soft orange light, she considered how different the present felt from that long-ago drive of exile. She was no longer reacting to accusation or defending her integrity. She was participating in structured decisions that protected everyone involved. The transformation had not been sudden. It had unfolded through documentation, accountability, and repeated evidence of reliability. And as the road stretched steadily ahead, Eleanor understood that equilibrium was not the absence of past mistakes. It was the presence of systems strong enough to prevent them from repeating. By early summer, the consultations with assisted living communities had been completed, and the cost comparisons lay neatly arranged inside Eleanor's leather folder. Two facilities within 25 miles of Columbus offered comprehensive memory care units with structured daily support, transparent pricing models, and clear medical oversight policies. The projected monthly expense, though significant, was manageable within the restored account framework if supplemented by Robert's pension and Social Security benefits. At the same time, contractor bids for modifying the house had arrived, detailing the cost of installing a stair lift, widening hallway door frames to 36 inches, and redesigning the downstairs bathroom to accommodate mobility limitations. The financial difference between adapting the home and transitioning to assisted living was narrower than Margaret had expected. One Saturday afternoon, the family gathered again at the dining table to review the options. Robert listened quietly, occasionally asking whether he would still be able to sit near a window and read his newspaper each morning. Claire assured him that both options could provide that comfort. Eleanor guided the discussion, methodically, outlining not only costs but also long-term sustainability. She explained that progressive memory decline would likely require increasing levels of supervision within 2 to 3 years, and that early transition to a structured environment might prevent crisis decisions later. There was no pressure in her tone, only projection grounded in data. Margaret held her hands together thoughtfully, acknowledging that remaining in the house carried emotional comfort but practical risk. Claire, who once resisted Eleanor's structured approach, now leaned toward it. She admitted that managing both finances and care without oversight in the past had contributed to poor decisions. This time, she wanted stability rather than sentiment to guide them. After nearly 2 hours of careful conversation, they reached a provisional agreement to begin the application process at the assisted living community that offered integrated medical support and transparent billing practices. No final decision would be made without visiting the facility together with Robert, but preparation would begin. As papers were organized and dates penciled into the shared digital calendar, Eleanor felt a familiar sense of alignment. This was not about control. It was about prevention. The systems in place ensured that no single person could redirect responsibility unchecked. Later, as she stepped outside onto the front porch before beginning her drive back to Cincinnati, Claire joined her. The evening air carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Claire said quietly that 5 years earlier, she would have interpreted Eleanor's calm authority as judgment. Now she saw it as structure that protected everyone, including herself. Eleanor responded that discipline is not about dominance. It is about safeguarding what matters before emotion distorts it. There was no dramatic reconciliation in that exchange, only recognition. As Eleanor drove south under a sky streaked with late summer light, she reflected on how far the family had traveled without raising their voices. The transformation had not come from confrontation or dramatic apology. It had come from consistent systems, independent verification, and the quiet strength to wait for truth to surface fully. And in that steady progression from accusation to accountability, Eleanor understood that the real victory had never been about proving herself right. It had been about ensuring that clarity would outlast confusion. The visit to the assisted living community took place on a bright Saturday morning in early June, the sky clear and the air warm without being heavy. Eleanor arrived in Columbus before 9 o'clock and met Claire and Margaret in the driveway before they drove together to the facility located just 18 miles from the house. The building stood behind landscaped grounds with wide walking paths and benches positioned beneath mature oak trees. Inside, the lobby was quiet, filled with natural light and the soft scent of polished wood. A staff coordinator greeted them and guided the family through the memory care wing, explaining daily routines, medication management protocols, and structured activity schedules designed to preserve cognitive function as long as possible. Eleanor asked practical questions about staffing ratios, emergency response procedures, and billing transparency. The coordinator provided clear answers, outlining written policies, and providing sample monthly statements that detailed every charge. Claire listened closely, occasionally glancing toward Eleanor as if measuring the information against her sister's standard of scrutiny. Robert walked slowly beside them, pausing near a large window overlooking a courtyard garden. He asked whether he would be able to bring his favorite armchair and his framed photograph collection. The coordinator smiled and assured him that personal furnishings were encouraged to make the space feel familiar. Margaret's eyes softened at that reassurance. After touring the dining hall and a private room available for Robert if they chose to proceed, the family gathered in a small conference office to review projected costs and admission timelines. Eleanor compared the facility's monthly rate against the previously calculated long-term budget, confirming that pension income, Social Security benefits, and investment reserves would sustain the expense without depleting principal funds prematurely. She spoke calmly, not to dominate the conversation, but to ensure clarity before commitment. Claire asked Robert directly how he felt about the possibility of moving. He looked thoughtful and admitted that he sometimes felt disoriented at home, especially at night. He said that being in a place designed for his needs might be easier for everyone. The statement shifted the room's tone from deliberation to preparation. Margaret nodded slowly, acknowledging that familiarity had to be balanced against safety. By the end of the meeting, the application paperwork had been initiated, with an anticipated move and date scheduled for late summer. Driving back to the house afterward, silence filled the car, not heavy with regret, but layered with reflection. That afternoon, Eleanor helped organize Robert's important documents into labeled folders, ensuring that every account, policy, and directive was accessible and cross-referenced. There were no rushed decisions, no emotional ultimatums, only careful sequencing. As evening approached, Claire stood beside Eleanor in the kitchen and said that 5 years earlier she would have resisted this level of structure, believing it signaled distrust. Now she understood that structure was the opposite. It was protection against uncertainty. Eleanor replied simply that clarity preserves dignity. Later, as she drove back to Cincinnati beneath a fading summer sky, she considered how the path from accusation to collaboration had unfolded without spectacle. The systems they had built were not dramatic, but they were durable. And durability, she knew, was what would carry them through whatever came next.